I should have let him die, but that's not who I am. The fluorescent lights above me flickered like they were deciding the same thing as I was, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with something sharper filled my lungs as the ER doors burst open at exactly 2:17 a.m. I remember the wheels of the gurney screeching against the polished floor, the urgency in every step, the way every conversation in the room died without warning. I didn't know his name yet, but I felt it. The shift, like the air itself, had become heavier. Clear the room. Someone ordered, low and controlled. Not a doctor, not hospital staff, something else. I glanced up and saw the suits standing too still, watching too closely, like they weren't here for help, but for control. The patient was tall, pale, his shirt cut open just enough for the monitors, his breathing uneven, fading. I stepped closer because that's what I do. Because I've been doing double shifts for 3 years straight. Because I have a 5-year-old son who thinks I can fix anything. We're losing him, the attending said, frustration breaking through his calm. Charts flipped, numbers called out, nothing working the way it should. Then someone looked at the lab results, then at me. I knew that look. Rare blood type. They said it without saying it. The kind that doesn't wait for donors. The kind that forces decisions. I felt every eye in the room land on me at once. I thought about my son asleep at home, about the rent due in 5 days, about how tired I was down to my bones. I should have stepped back. I should have said no. But instead, I heard my own voice cut through the noise, steady in a way I didn't feel. Take mine. Silence followed, thick and immediate. Even the machines seemed to pause. One of the men stepped forward, his gaze sharp enough to make my chest tighten, and for a second I wondered if I had just signed something I didn't understand. But there was no time to think, only to act. The process blurred into motion, controlled, clinical, necessary. I focused on the rhythm, on the sound of the monitors, on anything but the weight of what was happening. Seconds stretched into something longer, heavier. Then it happened, a single steady tone that made my heart drop before the room erupted into movement again. Wait, someone said, and I held my breath without realizing it. Then a sound broke through, soft but unmistakable, a heartbeat returning where there had been none. Relief didn't come the way I expected. It came tangled with something else, something colder. I looked up just as his eyes opened, dark, sharp, aware in a way that didn't match someone who had just been at the edge, and they locked onto mine like he had been looking for me the entire time. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, couldn't explain the strange certainty settling in my chest. He didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't even seem surprised. He just watched me, like I wasn't a stranger, like I wasn't just a nurse who made a decision in a moment that would disappear by morning. But something in that look told me it wouldn't disappear, not for him, and not for me. And in that instant, standing under those flickering lights with my pulse still racing in his gaze holding mine, I realized I hadn't just saved a life. I had stepped into something I didn't understand, something that was already closing around me, quiet and inevitable, like a promise I never agreed to but couldn't escape. I thought it would end there, just another shift, another patient, another story I would carry home and quietly forget. But by the time the sun came up, nothing in my life felt the same. I walked out of the hospital just after 7 a.m., the sky pale and colorless, my body heavy with exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix, and all I wanted was to get home to my son, to make him breakfast, to pretend that the night had not happened. But the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt it again, that same shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. A black car was parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. I told myself it meant nothing, that the city was full of cars like that, but my instincts did not agree. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking, counting my steps, focusing on something normal, something safe. When I reached my apartment building, I fumbled with my keys more than usual, my hands still not steady, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. The way his eyes had locked onto mine like I was not just a nurse, but something else entirely. Inside, the familiar smell of home wrapped around me, warm and grounding. My son's small shoes were by the door, his drawings taped crookedly to the wall, everything exactly as I'd left it. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "Mom," his voice called softly from the bedroom, still half asleep, and I forced a smile into my voice as I answered him. "Moving." Through our morning routine on autopilot, cereal poured, cartoons playing, his laughter filling the space that had felt too quiet just moments before. For a while, it worked. The normalcy, the illusion that I was still in control of my life. Until there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just precise, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side already knew I would answer. My heart stuttered once, hard enough to make me pause. I was not expecting anyone. I opened the door slowly, keeping my son behind me without thinking. The man standing there was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression calm, unreadable. He held out a small envelope like it was the most natural thing in the world. "For Olivia Hayes," he said, his voice polite, controlled. I hesitated before taking it, my fingers brushing the smooth paper, heavier than it should have been. "Who is this from?" I asked, even though something deep in my chest already knew the answer. The man gave a slight nod, almost respectful, before stepping back. "From Mr. Cole," he said, like that explained everything, like it should, and then he was gone. I closed the door slowly, the click of the lock louder than it should have been, my pulse rising again. My son tugged at my sleeve, asking for juice, for attention, for something simple, and I forced myself to move, to stay grounded, to not let whatever this was take over my home. But the envelope stayed in my hand, impossible to ignore. When I finally opened it, there was no letter, no explanation, just a single card and a number written in clean, deliberate ink, along with something else that made my breath catch. A receipt, stamped and finalized, every single one of my overdue bills paid in full. Rent, utilities, even the medical balance I had been chipping away at for months. I stared at it, my mind struggling to catch up, to understand what I was looking at, what it meant. Nothing in my life came without a cost. I had learned that the hard way. Nothing was ever just given. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I could think any further. An unknown number. I should not have answered. Every instinct told me not to, but I did anyway. I pressed the phone to my ear, my voice quieter than I intended. "Hello." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then his voice, low, steady, unmistakable. "Good morning, Olivia," he said, like we were already familiar, like he had every right to know my name. To say it like that, my breath caught, my grip tightening around the phone. "You should not have done that." I managed, not even sure what I meant. The blood, the money, all of it. A soft exhale came through the line. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything I could place. "And yet you did," he replied, calm, certain. Another pause, heavier this time, filled with something unspoken. "Now," he continued, his voice lowering just enough to send a chill down my spine. "We need to talk about what happens next." I should have hung up the moment I heard his voice, but something in the way he said my name made it impossible, like he had already stepped into my life and rearranged it without asking. I turned away from my son, lowering my voice as I moved toward the kitchen, trying to create distance from something I could not even explain. "There is nothing to talk about," I said, forcing steadiness into my tone, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me back into something normal. A quiet pause followed, not empty, but deliberate, like he was measuring my reaction instead of reacting to it. "There is everything to talk about," he replied, calm, controlled, the kind of certainty that did not need to be loud to be absolute. I swallowed, my mind racing through possibilities I did not want to consider, through the envelope, the paid bills, the car outside. The way his men had looked at me like I was no longer invisible. "You sent that money," I said, stating it instead of asking, because I already knew. "I corrected an inconvenience," he answered, as if my entire financial struggle had been nothing more than a minor detail to him. Heat rose in my chest, not gratitude, not relief, something sharper, something closer to anger. "You do not get to do that," I said, my voice tightening despite myself. I did not ask for anything. Another pause, longer this time, and I could almost picture him on the other end, perfectly still, perfectly composed. "You did not have to," he said quietly. The words settled into the space between us in a way that made my breath catch, because they were not a response, they were a decision. I shook my head even though he could not see me, trying to push back against something I could feel closing in. "Listen to me," I said, softer now but firmer. "I did my job. That is all this was. You do not owe me anything, and I do not owe you anything. The silence that followed was different, heavier, like something had shifted. When he spoke again, his voice had changed just enough for me to notice. That is where you are wrong, Olivia, he said, and my name sounded different this time. Less like recognition and more like possession. A chill moved down my spine before I could stop it. I tightened my grip on the phone, forcing myself not to react. I do not belong to anyone, I said quickly, the words coming out sharper than I intended. A quiet exhale came through the line, almost thoughtful. No, he agreed, and for a brief second, I thought the conversation might end there, that I had drawn a line he would respect. But then he continued, and everything in me stilled. But your life is now connected to mine, he said, each word measured, deliberate, impossible to ignore. My pulse quickened, my thoughts colliding with each other, trying to find something logical, something safe. That does not make any sense, I said, though my voice betrayed the uncertainty I was trying to hide. It will? He replied, calm as ever. I glanced toward the living room where my son sat cross-legged on the floor, completely unaware of the way my world was quietly shifting around us. I lowered my voice even more, stepping further away as if distance could protect him. What do you want from me? I asked, finally voicing the question that had been building since the moment I opened that envelope. There was no hesitation this time. For now, he said, I want you to come and see me. The simplicity of the request made it more unsettling, not less. I closed my eyes for a brief second, exhaustion and tension pressing in from every direction. No, I said. The answer immediate, instinctive, the only thing that felt like mine. Another pause followed, but this one was different, quieter, almost patient. You will, he said, not as a command, not raised, not forceful, but certain in a way that made my chest tighten again. I opened my eyes, staring at the wall in front of me, as if it could offer an answer. Why would I do that? I asked, needing to understand something, anything. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough to send a quiet, undeniable warning through me. Because the people who wanted me gone, he said slowly, now know that you are the reason I am still here. I felt the world tilt slightly under my feet as his words settled in, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and precise, like something already decided long before I had a chance to understand it. I turned slowly, my eyes landing on my son again, still sitting on the floor, completely safe in his small world of cartoons and cereal, and for a moment everything inside me tightened. You are saying this to scare me, I whispered into the phone, forcing control back into my voice even as my heart began to race. No, Sebastian replied, just as quietly, and somehow that made it worse. I am saying this because it is already happening. I swallowed, my gaze drifting toward the window without meaning to, toward the street below. The black car was still there, exactly where I had seen it earlier, engine still running, unmoving, patient. My grip on the phone tightened. You put that car there, I said, my voice lower now, sharper, trying to hold on to something solid. Yes, he answered, without hesitation. Honesty should have made this easier, but it did not. It only made everything more real. Then take it away, I said quickly, almost immediately. I do not need protection. I did not ask for any of this. There was a pause, not resistance, not hesitation, something else, something like calculation. That is exactly why you need it, he said finally. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my thoughts tangling together, refusing to settle. You do not get to decide that, I said, my voice rising just enough for me to notice. You made a choice last night, he replied, still calm, still controlled. And choices have consequences, whether you want them or not. The words hit harder than they should have, because they were not wrong, and I hated that. I turned my back to the window, pressing my hand against my forehead, trying to think, trying to find a way out of something that felt like it was closing in from all sides. I have a son, I said, quieter now, not as an argument, but as a fact, the only thing that mattered. The line went silent for a second, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, subtle but real. I know, he said. The two words sent a sharp, immediate tension through my chest. You do not get to know that, I said quickly, my voice tightening. my body going still. "Olivia," he said, and this time my name sounded different. Less like control and more like something measured, something careful. "If I did not know, you would already be in danger." I closed my eyes for a brief second, the weight of that sentence settling in deeper than I wanted it to. I hated how easily he said it, how certain he sounded. Like this was not a possibility but a reality I had simply not caught up to yet. "Then tell me what you want," I said again, more controlled this time, more deliberate, because I needed something clear, something I could fight against. There was no immediate answer, just the faint sound of his breathing on the other end, steady, unhurried. "I want to make sure you and your son are safe," he said finally. The simplicity of it should have been reassuring, but it was not. Nothing about this felt simple. "And in return?" I asked, because there was always something in return. There had to be. Another pause, longer this time, like he was choosing his words more carefully than before. "In return," he said slowly, "you will come to see me, and you will let me explain why this is not optional." I let out a quiet breath, my mind already resisting, already pushing back. I said no. I replied, holding on to that word like it was the last thing that still belonged to me. Silence answered me, heavy but not empty. Then his voice returned, softer than before, but somehow more final. "Then I will come to you," he said. My eyes snapped open, my heart skipping hard enough to make me take a step back. "No," I said immediately, sharper now, fear slipping through before I could stop it. "You are not coming here." Another quiet exhale came through the line, almost thoughtful. "Olivia," he said, calm and steady, "I am already closer than you think." My breath caught, my head turning toward the door without meaning to. The space suddenly feeling smaller, tighter, and for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly, something cold and undeniable. This was no longer a conversation I could walk away from. My heart was still racing when the line went silent, but the silence did not feel like an ending. It felt like something waiting. I stood there for a second longer, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing, until I slowly pulled it away, my reflection faint in the dark screen, eyes wider than I wanted to admit. I turned toward the door again, the same door I had locked just minutes ago, the same door that suddenly did not feel like enough. "Mom?" My son's voice broke through the tension, small and unaware, and I forced myself to move, to breathe, to step back into something normal. I crouched down beside him, brushing his hair back gently, grounding myself in the warmth of his presence. "Everything is okay," I said softly, more for myself than for him, because I needed those words to be true. He nodded, already distracted again, already safe in a way I suddenly realized could change without warning. I stood up slowly, my gaze drifting back to the door, then to the window, then back again, my mind refusing to settle. He said he was close. The words echoed, quiet but persistent. I told myself it was just another tactic, another way to push me into doing what he wanted, but something deeper told me not to ignore it. I moved toward the door carefully, each step measured, my hand hovering over the handle before I touched it. I checked the lock again. Even though I knew it was already secure, the click louder this time, sharper. Then I leaned forward just enough to look through the peephole. For a second, there was nothing, just the empty hallway, the faded carpet, the quiet that had always felt ordinary before this moment. I let out a breath, tension loosening slightly in my chest. Maybe he had meant something else. Maybe this was all still at a distance I could manage. But then a shadow moved at the edge of the frame. My breath caught instantly, my body going still before I even understood why. Someone stepped into view, not hurried, not uncertain, just there, tall, composed, wearing a dark coat that looked too precise for this building, too deliberate. My heart began to pound again, louder this time, harder. I did not need to see his face clearly to know. The recognition came from something else, something deeper than sight. I stepped back from the door immediately, my hand flying to my mouth before I could stop it, my pulse roaring in my ears. He was not supposed to be here. Not like this. Not so close. A soft knock followed, controlled, measured, exactly like before. The same kind of knock that did not ask for permission, but expected an answer. My son looked up from the floor, curious, starting to stand, but I moved faster, placing myself between him and the door without thinking. Stay here, I said quietly, my voice steady in a way I did not feel. Another knock, just as calm, just as certain. I closed my eyes for half a second, forcing myself to think, to choose. Ignoring him would not make him leave. I knew that already. Nothing about this man suggested he walked away from anything once he had decided otherwise. I stepped forward again, slower this time, my hand hovering over the lock, every instinct inside me pulling in different directions. Fear, anger, something else I could not name. The silence on the other side of the door felt heavier now, like it was waiting for me to catch up. I rested my forehead briefly against the cool wood, my breath uneven, my thoughts finally narrowing into one clear realization. This was no longer something happening around me. This was something I was already inside. I straightened slowly, my fingers tightening around the lock. You said you wanted to talk, I whispered under my breath, more to myself than to him. Then I unlocked the door. The sound clicked through the quiet like a decision I could not take back. I opened it just enough to see him, standing exactly where I had seen his shadow, exactly where he said he would be. Sebastian Cole did not look surprised, did not look rushed, did not look like a man who had just crossed into someone else's life uninvited. He looked like he had always been there. His eyes found mine immediately, steady, unreadable, but not cold. Good, he said quietly, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Now we can speak properly. He did not wait to be invited in, but he did not force his way either. He simply stood there, calm and composed, as if the space between us already belonged to him. I kept my hand on the door, not opening it wider, not stepping back, holding onto the last piece of control I had left. You should not be here, I said, my voice low but steady. Even as my pulse refused to slow, Sebastian tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that felt too precise, too aware. And yet I am, he replied, his tone even, not confrontational, just certain. The hallway behind him was empty, too quiet, like the entire building had decided to stay out of this. I glanced past him for a second, half expecting to see someone else, more men, more presence, but there was no one, just him. Somehow, that made it worse. You need to leave, I said, firmer this time, my grip tightening on the edge of the door. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but it changed just enough for me to notice, like he was recalculating instead of reacting. If I leave, he said slowly, you will not understand what is coming. The words settled heavily between us, pulling at something I did not want to acknowledge. I shook my head, forcing resistance back into my voice. You do not get to decide what I understand, I replied. A brief silence followed, and then he exhaled. Quietly, almost like he had expected that answer. No, he said, but I do get to decide what reaches you. A chill ran through me before I could stop it. I hated how easily he said things like that, like the world moved differently around him. Behind me, I heard my son shift, the soft sound of movement on the floor, and my attention snapped back instantly. I stepped forward without thinking, blocking the doorway more completely, my body instinctively placing distance between Sebastian and everything that mattered to me. His eyes flickered past me for the briefest second, not intrusive, not searching, just aware. Then they returned to mine. He is safe, Sebastian said quietly, as if he had read the exact thought that had just crossed my mind. I did not respond, did not move, did not trust that reassurance even if part of me wanted to. You said you wanted to talk, I said instead, forcing the conversation back into something defined, something I could control. His gaze held mine for another second before he nodded once, deliberate. I did, he said, but not like this. My brow tightened slightly, confusion cutting through the tension. Then how? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He shifted his stance just enough to make it clear he was not leaving, not until this moved forward. You are going to come with me, he said, not raised, not forced, just stated like a fact. My reaction was immediate, instinctive. No, I said, sharper this time, stepping back just enough to make the boundary clear. His expression did not change, but something in the air between us did, tightening, focusing. Olivia, he said, my name quieter now, almost careful. If you stay here, you remain exposed. I let out a small, incredulous breath, shaking my head. You are the one who brought this here. I replied, my voice steady despite the tension building in my chest. No, he corrected, just as calmly. I am the one who followed it to you. The distinction hit harder than I expected, because it meant something I had not wanted to consider, something beyond him, beyond this moment. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something that would tell me this was an exaggeration, a tactic, anything other than the truth. But his expression gave me nothing, no urgency, no panic, just certainty. You think I am going to walk out of my home with a man I barely know? I said, quieter now, the edge still there but tempered by something else, something closer to doubt. No, he said, and for the first time, his voice softened just slightly. I think you are going to choose what keeps your son safe. The words landed exactly where they were meant to, precise and unavoidable. Silence followed, heavy and stretching, as my thoughts collided with each other. Every instinct fighting for control. I glanced back again, just for a second, at the small figure in my living room, at the life I had built piece by fragile piece. When I looked back at Sebastian, he had not moved, had not pushed, had not needed to. And in that moment, I realized something I did not want to accept. He was not forcing me to leave. He was waiting for me to understand why I already had to. The morning light spilled through the blinds in thin, sharp lines, cutting across the living room floor where my son played quietly, unaware of the storm that had already touched our lives. I stood in the kitchen, coffee cup trembling slightly in my hands, every sip tasting bitter against the lingering tension of the night before. The envelope sat on the counter, unopened this time, as if even looking at it might pull the world back into that heavy, controlled silence that had followed me since. The hospital. My thoughts circled around every detail, every word, every pause in his voice, and I could not decide which frightened me more, the certainty in his tone or the patience that had accompanied it. I had lived my life making choices that protected my son, that kept our world small and manageable, and now that control felt fragile, slipping through my fingers in ways I had not been prepared for. The phone buzzed softly on the counter, unknown number again, and I froze my body, instinctively bracing even before I reached for it. Olivia, his voice came, calm, deliberate, carrying the same weight it had the night before. You are awake, and so am I. It is time we stop hiding from what is already here. I exhaled slowly, holding the phone closer, my free hand pressing lightly against my chest to steady the sudden rush of adrenaline. I do not understand why you are here, why this is necessary, I said, my words more steady than I felt, but each syllable carried the tension of someone navigating a world they had never wanted to enter. Another pause, long enough for the silence to stretch and fill the room. And then, because the people who wish to remove me are still thinking, and you are the reason I am still standing, he said. Each word deliberate, precise, and impossible to ignore. My grip tightened on the phone, knuckles widening, as my thoughts collided with the undeniable truth that he was already inside my life, whether I accepted it or not. I glanced at my son, his small hands stacking blocks, unaware of the complicated currents swirling around him, and I felt a sharp protective surge that anchored me for a moment, letting me gather some composure. Then what do you expect me to do? I asked finally, voice quiet but firm, trying to reclaim the space that felt like it was being carefully taken from me. Come with me, he replied, soft, almost gentle, yet carrying the force of inevitability. I shook my head, stepping back instinctively. I cannot. Not like this. Not when he is here. When everything is, I trailed off, the words failing under the weight of reality. Silence followed, thick, tense. And then he spoke again, measured, calm. You will understand soon enough, and you will choose to keep him safe, and by extension, yourself. I am not asking, Olivia, I am informing. And in that moment, I realized there was no room left for hesitation, no space to pretend I could simply return to normal. The decision was no longer about me alone. It was about the life I had built, about the fragile certainty of my son's mornings, and about a man whose presence had already changed the rules of our world without force, without intrusion, but with an authority that left me with only one clear path forward. I exhaled again, letting the tension ebb just enough to step toward the door, the sun catching the lines of the envelope on the counter as if reminding me that every choice, every step, would carry weight far beyond what I had ever imagined. I reached for the door handle slowly, deliberately, my reflection in the glass showing a woman who was alert, cautious, but resolute, ready to face whatever explanation awaited on the other side, knowing that once I stepped out, the balance of our lives would shift in ways I could not yet fully predict, but that I could not ignore. The car ride was quiet, but not empty. The hum of the engine and the faint scent of leather filled the space between us as I sat in the back seat, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to make sense of the last few hours. Outside, the city moved in familiar rhythms, unaware of the tension contained within the small black SUV. The streets bathed in the pale orange glow of streetlights and early morning traffic. I had 1,000 questions I wanted to ask, but I knew better than to speak first. To break the careful silence Sebastian had established, his presence was deliberate, each movement controlled, his hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes forward, not glancing at me, yet aware of every shift I made. The quiet between us was filled with meaning, a language I was only beginning to understand, a tension that spoke louder than any words could. Finally, I could not hold my thoughts in anymore. The need to know clawing at the edges of my composure. Why me? I asked softly, not looking at him, my voice barely above the hum of the car. He exhaled slowly, a faint tilt of his head acknowledging the question without the pressure of immediate answer. Because you made a choice without knowing the consequences, he said, voice even, precise, carrying weight that pressed against me without touch. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze out the window, focusing on the blur of streetlights and signs, anything to steady my racing heart. I did what I had to do, I murmured, almost to myself, almost as a reassurance. I know. He replied simply, yet in those two words, the acknowledgement cut deeper than I expected, a recognition of agency, of bravery, and yet a reminder that my actions had tied us together in ways I could not unravel. The car turned onto a quieter street, the cityscape opening into a stretch of road lined with familiar brownstones. Yet somehow everything felt unfamiliar, charged with the weight of what had happened, of what was unfolding, and of the unspoken understanding between us. I stole a glance at him, and this time he met my eyes briefly, a fraction of a second, yet enough to communicate something unspoken, something deliberate, something that made my pulse quicken and my mind reel. You need to understand, he said quietly, leaning slightly forward, voice calm but firm, that nothing will be the same after today, not for you, not for your son, not for me. I nodded slowly, words failing me. The gravity of his statement pressing down on me, the silence that followed a living, breathing thing, stretching across the car like a tether. I will protect you, he added after a moment, almost as if clarifying a rule already in place. And you will make sure you protect him too. The simplicity of the statement belied the weight it carried, the authority behind it undeniable, the quiet intensity of it settling around me like a cloak I could not remove. I exhaled, the sound caught somewhere in my chest, feeling both trapped and strangely reassured, knowing that my decisions, my courage, my very presence had already woven me into his world, a reality that I could neither ignore nor escape. The city lights stretched ahead as we moved forward, and I realized that the choice had shifted from whether I would step into this new world to how I would navigate it, with every step measured, deliberate, and aware that nothing about the life I had known would remain unchanged. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, taking shallow breaths, my hands still clasped tightly, the faint vibration of the engine under me a reminder of the journey we had begun, a journey I could not yet see the end of, but one I knew I had to face. The car slowed to a stop in front of an unfamiliar building, tall and imposing, its sleek glass reflecting the early morning light in jagged angles. I stepped out cautiously, the cool air hitting my face and bringing with it the faint scent of the city still asleep, a reminder that life continued outside the tension I carried with me. Sebastian exited first, his movements precise, measured, his dark coat brushing softly against the doorframe as he paused to survey the surroundings before glancing back at me, his gaze calm, commanding, yet impossibly aware of every hesitation in my posture. I followed slowly, hands still clenched at my sides, every instinct alert, every thought calculating the safest way forward, the quiet streets echoing each step as we moved in silence toward the entrance. The doors opened seamlessly before us, welcoming yet imposing, and I could feel the shift immediately, the space inside charged with a presence I could not name, not yet, but already felt. Sebastian led the way, his voice quiet, deliberate, "Stay close." And I obeyed instinctively, the words not a command, but a gentle assertion of control. I could not ignore. The lobby was sleek, almost sterile, light bouncing off marble and polished metal, shadows stretching in the corners as if waiting for the story we were about to unfold. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rapid rhythm of my heart, the echo of the past nights, the hospital, the black SUV, the words spoken in the quiet corridors of my apartment still fresh in my mind. He guided me through the hallways with an ease that suggested familiarity, a confidence in every turn. And I could not help but notice how everyone we passed gave him space, some nodding slightly, all eyes acknowledging a presence I had only just begun to understand. "You are safe here," he said, voice low, calm, carrying the weight of certainty, and I could not decide whether to trust the words or fear them, because the lines between protection and possession had never seemed so thin. We stopped at a large office with walls of glass, sunlight spilling in and cutting across the floor in sharp, golden lines, and he gestured for me to enter, his eyes holding mine for the briefest second, a silent question in the space between us, testing, measuring. I stepped inside, every nerve alert, my senses heightened, the quiet ticking of a clock marking seconds that felt like hours, each one amplifying the gravity of the moment. Sebastian remained just outside, allowing me the space yet asserting his presence. A paradox that left me unsettled and aware that every action, every choice I had made, had led to this point, that there was no going back to the ordinary life I had known. I let my gaze sweep the room, noting the meticulous order, the subtle signs of careful design, everything curated, controlled, and I realized that just as he had saved his life through me, this space, this moment, was about the life I had just stepped into, a life now connected to him, tethered by choices I had made in courage, in instinct, and in necessity. He finally stepped in beside me, close but not touching, and said simply, "Now you will understand why I followed, why I am here, why nothing has been random." And in that instant, the air thickened with understanding, the clarity of a bond formed in the crucible of survival, protection, and undeniable presence. And I knew that whatever happened next, our lives had already shifted irrevocably, and the story we were about to unfold together would define not only him, but me, and the small world I had fought to protect.